Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to take a real-world look at the overall resolution and sharpness of the new Canon 70 to 300 millimeter f4 to 5.6 IS II USM lens. I've been following this lens since its announcement, and I have seen enthusiasm for it kind of yo-yo up and down. Initially, people were excited about it and hoped that it would follow the trend of the 55 to 250 STM that provided a pretty remarkable optical performance at an inexpensive price. This, of course, is full frame compatible, unlike that lens, and so it makes it interesting to a kind of bigger pool of people. However, enthusiasm for it started to wane when some of the early reviews started coming back, and some said that it really wasn't all that much sharper than the version 1, and some even went so far as to say that it was less sharp. So I have spent some time with it trying to break that down for myself. For years, the Tamron 70 to 300 VC lens has been the one that has been acclaimed as being basically the sharpest and best of the consumer grade 70 to 300 lenses. And so I've got one of those in as a comparison test, and also just for the fun of it, I even threw in the Canon 100 to 400 L Mark II lens that I happen to own myself. I no longer own the 70 to 300 L because I sold it to buy the 100 to 400 L. And of course, it's immensely more expensive, but I thought it'd be interesting to see how that this lens holds up in the comparison of some of the overlap of the focal lengths. And so we're going to try to answer the question of whether or not this lens is sharp or if it isn't sharp in real-world shooting. Let's jump in and let's take a look at some real photos. All right, we're going to start off by looking at a series of comparisons between the Canon on the left side and the Tamron on the right side. Now, you're going to note that framing almost never lines up between these lenses, although they are the exact same focal length, on the lens itself. You'll find that at equal distance that the Canon frames tighter, which means it's not as wide as the Tamron. And so 70 millimeters doesn't mean the same thing with both these lenses. And then on the other end, the Canon does a fair bit of focus breathing, and so they don't frame the same on the other end either. But today we're really looking more at the overall sharpness. And so here we have large JPEGs. This is taken out of a Canon 5D Mark IV and without any kind of corrections applied to them. So in the center of the frame, you can see that wide open, this is 70 millimeters f4, that the Canon is definitely giving an overall stronger performance here. Just more detail, better contrast. Out closer to the sides, we're going to find the same to be true, although both of them are guilty of some line doubling here and just not particularly resolving that well along the closer to the edges of the frame wide open. And you can see the same thing over on this side, although I still favor the Canon's rendering here. I think that it's handling the details just a little bit better. So here I just wanted to show you that if you stop them down one stopped f5.6, it does make quite a big difference at least on the Canon's performance. Both of them look better overall, but now at f5.6, this center looks really actually quite excellent on the Canon lens. And then over on the side, you see that there's been a pretty significant improvement, definitely more so than what's on the Tamron. The Canon benefits more from this stopping down than what the Tamron does. And on this side, that's really now a pretty excellent performance. So if I have a recommendation for you, sometimes this is what I do anyway with variable aperture lenses, is that I just go ahead and change the aperture value to f5.6 and then just treat it as a 70 to 300 f5.6. I think in this case you're going to like the results you get better. Just to give you an idea of a direct comparison difference between f4 and f5.6, you can see there's a huge uptick in resolution in the center of the frame, and then off at the side where we saw a lot of this kind of garbage, it's really cleared up at f5.6. And so I think using it at f5.6 is probably a wise move. So you can see a pretty huge difference due to that focus breathing, although I didn't quite nail 200 millimeters on the 70 to 300, but 9 millimeters is not a huge difference between the two of them. And so you can see the evidence of focus breathing. They were set up at the exact same, on a tripod, exact same distance away from our subjects. It's just there is some focus breathing on the Canon. It's a different approach to getting to it, and we'll discuss that more in a second. But if we look at the center of the frame, although the Canon may not frame as tightly, it certainly is giving a better performance. Less chromatic aberration, and nice contrast, nice detail in the center of the frame. We're going to see when further on in the focal range that the Tamron has a fair bit of lateral chromatic aberration. So lateral chromatic aberration, the good news is it's quite easy to fix in post, but the bad news is that stopping down the lens doesn't eliminate it. It's going to be there no matter what aperture value you choose, unlike the longitudinal chromatic aberration that shows up more as kind of like bokeh fringing or on the defocused area. So here you can see really a great performance from the Canon out towards the edges of the frame. This is wide open at 200-ish millimeters, and so you can see a little bit of that longitudinal chromatic aberration here, contrasted from the lateral CA that's here. Now, one thing to note is that the Tamron, it holds its apertures a little bit longer than what, well, in some cases a fair bit longer than what the Canon does. This new Canon is a pretty bad offender in that it doesn't hold its aperture positions very long. It quickly moves on to the smaller maximum aperture values. But, and so you can see that the Tamron is still at f5 while the Canon is at f5.6. However, I did shoot a series where I compared them at f5.6, and there's a minor bit of improvement for the Tamron, but really there's not a lot of difference overall. Now, if you were to remove this chromatic aberration, the difference between these two lenses would be less obvious, I think. The Tamron's actually producing good detail if you look down in here, but obviously that chromatic aberration kind of detracts from it. One thing to compare is just look at the screw here, and you can see that basically, in terms of overall detail, they're rendering about the same. But certainly a strong performance for the Canon here. All right, now at 300 millimeters, and so now both at f5.6, and if we look towards the center of the frame, we're going to see that, there's a little bit different approach here. Again, we're seeing that chromatic aberration on the Tamron, and so that kind of, it detracts a little bit from its overall performance. However, you can see that there's just better contrast. There's a little bit more of a hazy look at 300 millimeters, which has been the weak point of the Tamron overall. So the Canon has given us definitely a better performance there in the center. And here we can look right out towards the edge of the frame. And overall, there's not a huge difference between these two. There's the chromatic aberration, but in terms of the overall sharpness, I would say that the sharpness is quite similar. If we look on this side, however, I favor the Canon definitely. You can tell that it's less of a hazy performance. So overall, I would say that the Canon is giving us the best performance at 300 millimeters across the frame. And really, that's a pretty strong, wide open performance. And as you can see, looking at the image globally, it looks pretty great. Now, just for the fun of it, because I have it on hand, I put it up against the immensely more expensive Canon 100 to 400 millimeter f4.5 to 5.6 Mark II. And I no longer have the Canon 70 to 300 L series lens because I moved it in favor of the 100 to 400 L Mark II. So obviously this is perhaps Canon's best, variable aperture zoom out there. And you can tell in the center that this is a fantastic performance. It's pretty much flawless, no chromatic aberration, amazing contrast, amazing resolution and detail. However, when you look at the 70 to 300 image here, it's certainly not embarrassing itself. There's a little bit more of a haze there compared to the 100 to 400 L, but overall that looks quite good. And if we look towards the edge of the frame, yeah, absolutely, the 100 to 400 L2 is better. But still, as we look towards the edge, this Canon wide open 70 to 300 is not doing too badly. And if we look over on the right side, again, you can tell a difference, with the 100 to 400 L, but it's not huge. And so, I think that perhaps the reports of the poor image quality from this new lens have been somewhat overstated. Now, quick comparison at infinity between the Canon and the Tamron, and if we look out towards the center of the frame, overall, I like what I see from both lenses. You can tell, obviously, there's a different kind of color rendering from the Tamron on the right compared to the Canon. It's a little bit warmer here. But overall, in the center of the frame, both of these are doing quite a nice job. If we look out towards this left edge, I would say that here there's just I would say a very, very minor slight advantage for the Tamron. This is, I think, the weakest point for the Canon is the edge of the frame at 70 millimeters wide open. But the Tamron is not really beating it by much. And here, if we compare here and here, I like the contrast of the Canon a little bit better there. Now, if we move to 100 millimeters, I just threw the 100 to 400L Mark II on there for another point of comparison. And so you can see here, rendering at infinity, that yes, once again, the 100 to 400L is a little bit better. You can see a little bit crisper detail, a little better contrast. But, again, it's, for a lens that costs 3 to 4 times as much, it's not like it is blowing away this Canon 70 to 300. And so overall, I think that this is giving a pretty credible performance as we look at different spots on the frame, that the 70 to 300 is not embarrassing in itself. And so I would say, based on this comparison, that you're getting pretty decent bang for the buck out of this new 70 to 300. Now, at 300 millimeters, we didn't get the same framing at all. There had been some shifting. I was in a kind of some deep snow while shooting this, and so as I switched out the lenses, the tripod shifted around, kind of sunk down further into the snow, so I didn't get the same framing. However, I would say, if we just look at the overall detail, just a few spots here and there, again, at 300 millimeters, I think that the Canon 70 to 300 is really doing a pretty fantastic job and holding up, I would say, pretty well when compared to the optically incredible 100 to 400L Mark II. So moving on beyond comparisons, here's just a few kind of real-world images wide open, and so here, as we look at this, right out towards the edge of the frame, we've got a pretty great amount of detail rendered. This is shot from about 30 feet away and shot wide open f5.6 300 millimeters. So nothing to complain about there. Here, if we look in, sleepy puppy laying in the sun, we see that, again, there's nice detail in all of the fine hairs around the eye, which was the point of focus here. And so, again, nothing to complain about. Same thing, 300 millimeters, wide open. This was a handheld image of a calendar from about 12 feet away, and so I was actually pretty impressed by this, because if you look in here, you can see that it resolved actually the texture of the paper, kind of the weave of the paper, and here, getting pretty close to the edge of the frame, it's still got some nice contrast and detail overall, and so, I think that's a pretty great performance, really. Here's just a quick walk in the woods. Number one, look at the image globally. This is on 5D Mark IV. It's a pretty nice separation from the background here. The background bokeh isn't incredible, but it's fairly soft, and there's, some three-dimensional quality here. And then focus point, was somewhere right around here, and you can see nice detail on my son's face there. Here, once again, focus point was a pine cone. Again, nice detail, and the autofocus on this lens, by the way, is it's fantastic. Manual focus, not so much, but autofocus I really love with Nano USM. Here's one that I shot on a Canon 80D, and so I just wanted to give you, I'm trying to shoot some on an APS-C body, a little less expensive body, and so once again, I'd say that detail is pretty fantastic there at our focus point, and here we've got some that's still in the plane of focus, that closer to the edge that's showing up quite well, and in this case, I like the look of the bokeh overall. In fact, I think I may like the look of the bokeh rendering on APS-C a little bit better than I do on full frame. Here's from just a couple to wrap it up, from a portrait session that I did with the lens. And so, you know, again, this is wide open, and I'm shooting, obviously I'm not shooting at 300 millimeters, it's too much, but here, let's just take a quick peek at our, it was 115 millimeters there, but you can see a very nice texture and detail in the lens. I mean, it's not Otis level, obviously, but you certainly could use this lens to shoot some portraits and get a very nice, credible result. You know, lots of detail that's rendered. Color rendering here looks quite good. And so all in all, I think that this lens is a better optical performer, at least in the copy that I have, than what reports have made it out to be. So as you can see, the reports of this lens being soft or not optically strong, at least so far as the copy that I have in hand, that those reports are probably a bit overstated. I think that this is perhaps a byproduct of some of the early reviews being focused more on lab performance and less on real-world performance. Or maybe there is some sample variation, I don't know. But all I can tell you is that what I see with my own eyes tells me that this lens is actually quite good optically. And when I compare it to a number of similar type lenses that I've used in the past, I would say that outside, of course, of the L series lenses that are variable aperture that cover those same focal lengths, I think that this lens is really as good as what I've seen for a consumer grade lens. And of course, as we're going to see in the final review that'll be coming up probably in about a week, that you combine that with a nice build and a really impressive autofocus performance from the Nano USM, and you have what I believe is actually a pretty compelling lens. Keep following along in my coverage of this lens. If you look down in the description below, you can find my ongoing image gallery that I'm adding to on a regular basis. You can always also find linkage to do some shopping for the lens. Of course, if you haven't already clicked that subscribe button, please do so. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.